Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Aneta and I'm a technical writer at Red Hat.
My name is Dominika, I'm also technical writer at Red Hat.
And today we're going to share our experience from working in teams where documentation is not an afterthought, but has an actual seat at the table. Can you switch the slides? There. We're going to talk about a few best practices that we consider useful. We are not going to talk about how to implement these practices step by step, because we don't think that there is a single solution that would fit all teams. Instead, we are going to show you real examples of collaboration that worked for us. We're going to share our success stories. We're going to cover two main topics. The first one is how documentation can drive tests and feature design. The other topic is the benefits of working with the docs as code approach. We hope that these stories will serve as inspiration for your teams, whether you are a technical writer, a software engineer, a quality engineer, a team lead, product owner, whatever role you hold. There will be space for questions at the end. I am currently a technical writer for the Foreman project. It's being productized downstream as Red Hat Satellite. And Foreman is a lifecycle management tool that helps you manage large numbers of systems. Now, when I joined the Foreman team 2 years ago, I was amazed at how closely engineers work with writers. Each engineering team in downstream Satellite has a dedicated writer that stays in sync with the engineers. Engineers and writers strive to deliver code and docs at the same time. Our deadlines are closely aligned. And we want to be able to review each other's work transparently in order to improve both the docs and the code.
I'm currently working with the identity management team, but today I'll be speaking about documentation practices I experience in the InfiniSpan team. InfiniSpan is an open source in-memory database, and its Red Hat supported product version is called DataGrid. The documentation content originates in multiple community repositories from where it is brought to a central Red Hat repository, and the same set of files is published as part of the product documentation. We also worked together in sprints, and the feature was considered complete only if it had corresponding documentation. In general, InfiniSpan is a smaller team of experienced engineers and QAs that moves quickly and always includes their writer in the planning, triaging, and sprint reviews. Both of these teams, contributors develop code and documentation in locksteps, and they use the same platform, the same tools to collaborate and work in an agile manner. You might ask why. Because when writers aren't involved early, they are often left fixing problems when it is too late. This can look like documenting workarounds or confusions, but if you involve your writer earlier, then you can benefit not only from better documentation, but also better user experience. And there are other results from the teamwork. When writers work in the same sprints as developers, the documentation is more likely to be up to date. Also, as a writer, I can get feedback quickly. And for engineers, it means less context switching, because who would like to work on documentation for a feature they finished 6 months ago? And when writers join early, they bring user perspective. They help to spot usability issues before they even reach the users or customers. Writers also turn complex processes into, understandable and helpful, accessible content. This lowers barrier for the newcomers and also helps with software adoption. And I have a question for you. Do we have here anyone who was asked to document a new web UI, you know, maybe create a guide with a couple screenshots. Perfect. I know this too. I was asked as well, and this is never a good idea. For a writer, this is a nightmare, maintaining screenshots that will be outdated with the next release. Also, the user experience when I have my console on one monitor and then documentation on another monitor that I'm following. There is a better way. And if you have your writer working on documentation before the code freeze, they can review CLI help, inline help, tooltips, and help you to put the documentation inside the product and reduce the need for separate documentation later.
We have heard some great feedback from engineers themselves on the docs inclusive approach. To put it simply, what we are trying to do is to tear down the silos that sometimes exist between writers and the rest of the team. And we believe that in the end is the whole team that benefits from it, not just documentation. Let me start by describing what makes documentation a great way to imagine and define how you want users to use your software, even software that is yet to be written or software that is currently being written. Now, some of you might already be familiar with these concepts, but we do need to explain them before we get to our success stories later. As a developer, when you're writing code, you are doing it for users. I hope that at least some of you do it also because it's fun, but users should be on your mind. Then as a tester, you are testing that code. You're doing it for users too. You're doing it to make sure that users will be able to use that software without any major hiccups. And what do we as documentation authors do? Well, we explain how to use that software. We describe it. The common denominator here is users. The goal is to make sure that users are able to use the software. It's just that everyone looks at that goal from a slightly different angle. However, if they all work separately like this, isn't there a risk that the results of their work will diverge? That they will perhaps interpret the purpose of the software differently? Or perhaps that the tests won't cover the same scenarios as the ones that are documented? Or maybe that the code will implement a user path that is just too complex, too complicated to be documented in a simple enough way. Speaking as someone who has often been here at the last position, at the end of the food chain, I'd say that this model where everyone is working separately is just incredibly inefficient. By the time the task gets handed over to me, developers and QEs might have already moved on to something else, and it will be very difficult to get them engaged in reviewing documentation for something that they finished half a year ago. This might, of course, result in documentation reviews taking too long or not to happen at all. Then, as a writer, I sometimes even found myself having to reverse engineer the purpose of that software because I was missing that original user story. I was missing that original purpose with which that software was developed. This might result in documentation that doesn't actually match users' needs. So by now, we've talked about the risks of these roles working separately, right? In silos. There has to be a better way. What if everyone, instead of working separately, works in sync from the beginning with the same set of expectations, with a shared definition of the goal? Like this? During our time on Docs Inclusive Teams, we have found that teams produce better results when the various roles work as close together as possible, when everyone strives to drive the code, the tests, and the docs from the same initial input, and to continuously keep them in sync. That is easier said than done. But we do think that we have a few tricks that might help everyone get closer to that ideal. For example, we like to lean into user stories. Developers, testers, and writers can come together to define what it is that you will all do for your user. Each role then gets to ask specific questions specific to their field, And you make sure that the user story covers everything that everybody needs. For example, speaking as writer, a user story for documentation can sometimes include information on the skill level of that user. Are they a beginner? Are they advanced? Or that user story might include information on the type of that user. Are they an administrator or more of a frontline user? All of this then defines how many details we as writers need to include in documentation, which is why it's good when we are involved in the early stages. Another approach that I'm about to try with the team that I work with is to lean on the Scrum framework and do an initial sync up in Scrum planning sessions. That would mean to come up with a basic definition of what we want the workflow for users to look like, and to start writing the codes along with the code. Again, that sounds very simple in theory. I know that it will be not as easy in practice, but I still think it's worth trying. And that's what it's all about, what we're talking about trying things that might work. So we understand that making sure that all three roles work truly in sync is difficult to accomplish. We really appreciate that. We have experience with that. But we've done at least some things that worked for us. You might be familiar with the concept of docs-driven testing. The docs-driven testing model is certainly a good fit for the kind of docs-inclusive approach that we're talking about. In docs-driven testing, documentation drives testing. This means that documentation is the primary source of input for defining tests. For example, when the quality engineer on your team is asked to write a test, the first question they have is, where are the docs? Because they know that in order to write the test, they need to have a good idea of what users will actually be doing. If you give your quality engineer that kind of documentation, they can write tests that closely correspond to the expected workflow. And this is precisely what our first success story of the day is about. I will talk about how we approach documenting and testing the configuration of a Keycloak server as an authentication source for Foreman. In this case, we had the docs. An upstream contributor investigated how to accomplish the goal and raised a PR for it. Then me, as a writer, when I saw that documentation, I asked our quality engineer to verify the steps. Thanks to the documentation, that quality engineer knew exactly what we would be asking our users to do. So he rolled up his sleeves and started testing. And in the process, he provided fantastic real-time feedback back to me as a writer, which allowed me to further improve that documentation. And I really can't emphasize enough how well this approach worked for us. QE testing fresh docs, providing real-time feedback, that was a great foundation for working in a tight feedback loop. And working on the same thing at the same time ensured that there was no time lag, no distractions. And now the tester knows very well what the docs look like, and he helps keep them up to date by filing bugs whenever needed, which is awesome because it means that I have more bugs to fix. And then another slightly surprising benefit was that looking at the docs and seeing how complex the steps are, we realized as a whole team that the actual implementation of the feature has room for improvement, which is euphemism for saying that it's bad. And that documentation indeed records a fairly complex end-to-end user workflow, which told us that it would be a good idea to redesign the feature to make it simpler for users to use. So I wonder, could that suboptimal UX have been prevented if that procedure was written down while developing the feature itself? That brings me to the next topic, docs-driven development. Now, the idea behind docs-driven development is that instead of documenting code that has already been written and might be difficult to change or restructure at this point, you start by writing down what you want users to do with the code after you publish it. It might seem unnatural to start by documenting something that doesn't yet exist, but bear with us, there are benefits to it. One of these benefits is that you can share the docs draft with your stakeholders to get feedback. You can ask questions like, does everyone agree with this user workflow? Can anyone spot anything that would cause issues in the future? Or is this a solid foundation for a good UX? And then when everyone is on the same page with what you will be asking your users to do, that's when you start writing the code with the end-to-end workflow in mind. Our success story might not describe this exact model, but I think it comes very close. A few releases ago, the team I'm working with was working on a new web UI wizard for Foreman. The developer working on that wizard asked me to review the code PR. Now, I want you to know that I can't read code. I never tried, I never will. I'm okay with that. But the code did include text strings that I could read and review. So I asked for help setting up a test environment, and I played with the wizard a little. I started imagining what documentation I would need to write to guide users through the wizard, which fields were unclear, which buttons might need explaining. Small details like that were not entirely obvious from the interface itself. Except that instead of writing a procedure that would guide users through how to use that wizard, I just asked the developer to make a few changes to that wizard, to tweak the wording here, to add additional explanatory information there, small changes. This was not really a problem because the PR was still open, the feature was still being developed. And now, as a result, instead of asking users to read a procedure that explains how to follow a wizard in the web UI, users can just follow the wizard without any supporting docs needed. Quoting the developer himself, our collaboration helped make the wizard more mature. And on that note, I give the word back to Dominika.
Thank you, Aneta. And we'll dive to docs as code, because documentation is always a team effort. And when developers, writers, QAs all contribute, they all contribute in different ways. So it makes sense to bring them together in a shared space and shared workflow. But that's only one aspect of docs as code. There is so much more. It means that documentation is treated the same way as code. So documentation source files are stored in a Git repository, in a version control system, and preferably in the same repository as the code. Also, writers are using the same tools as developers. Git, GitHub, they have the same issue tracker, and they also use automation, CI/CD pipelines to automate builds and publishing of the documentation. So instead of keeping docs separate, everyone is working in one system in the same space. Engineers no longer need to review documentation that is in a separate space with different rules, but everyone works in one system, which simplifies collaboration. And of course, big part of it is tooling. As a writer, you can use automated builds, pre-commit hooks that are going to catch errors, spelling mistakes, or style violations before the commit is even merged. And of course, the same way as with Foreman, documentation updates happen in parallel with the code development. Overall, docs as code make collaboration more efficient, collaborative, and thanks to automation, reliable. Which brings me to the first success story. And while I wasn't the author of these changes, I think it is a fantastic success story to show how feedback from downstream customers can lead to strategic shift in documentation practices, moving the content upstream and integrating it with the code base. This story begins with customer feedback. Customer was migrating the data grid deployment to OpenShift. And while the data grid documentation made pretty good job at explaining what is data grid and those traditional standalone deployments, it led guidance for OpenShift and some best practices, real-world scenarios for Kubernetes-based platforms. Also, the documentation was in a separate space, and it was making it difficult to get timely feedback and keep it up to date. And when you have outdated documentation that takes too long to fix, it can damage the product reputation. Now, just think about the user. For them, it might not be obvious whether the bug is in the instructions or in the code. And to address this, it was in the time when the team was starting with new service, which means an opportunity to fresh start. And they moved documentation to the same repository as code, and including docs in the same sprint was their top priority. They also made changes to structure of the documentation. They adopted modular approach, which splits documentation into like a smaller, reusable, independent topics based on the information type. And this would help overall with maintenance, with separating reference content and sourcing it from the code. And the writer could focus on more task-based documentation, create tutorials and materials that would help to guide the user. And to support this workflow, also there's the tooling. So the upstream documentation would be built and published with the GitHub Actions. And for the downstream solution, they were using Jenkins job to sync the files regularly. So there wasn't even like an additional step for the writer. And these changes proved to be a sustainable and working model for the team. And it resulted in, more relevant, user-focused content. So, to summarize, like engineers, they already naturally write reference content. They, include code commands, they document APIs, they do man pages, and they are pretty good at it. So for us writers, there is no need to duplicate this content. We can review it, but instead we can focus on, providing more context, explaining the whys behind feature, clarify concept and provide those step-by-step instructions. As writers, we should be the champions of the user experience. Our main focus should be making sure documentation is accessible and helpful. And as Aneta mentioned earlier, when writers are involved early, there is no need to have a separate documentation for consoles, wizards, and other. And finally, automation. Docs as code is a lot about automation, and by automating documentation builds through CI/CD pipelines, it can help you to ensure consistency, quality, and again, allow writers to focus more on the content, while when you are in the same repository, engineers help to maintain the infrastructure. And while Docs as code offers real benefits, there are also challenges. Definitely any decisions about the tooling, about the style of the documentation, markup. This is something that a writer or the documentation team can no longer decide on their own. They need to include the whole team. It can also happen, especially with community documentation, that in the community you are using open source tools that everyone can use, while the company is pushing for proprietary solution that can basically prevent community contributors. And as a writer, I'll be speaking a bit about challenges for writers, which is definitely the step outside of comfort zone. You are joining engineers in their repository, in their space. This doesn't mean that you need engineering background. I don't have it, and it does not have it, and we were able to work in this environment. But the writer should be self-started, curious, interested in technology, and at least comfortable navigating the code base and using Git. And a big challenge is also balancing priorities. You might be documenting new feature while there is an important customer bug at the same time. And also with the writer to developer ratio, which is very often one writer for 10 developers, it's really hard to keep up with the changes. So, you might need to be constantly like reprioritizing, thinking, strategically, settling with those must-haves and leaving those nice-to-haves for later or never, because you might never get back to them. And of course, fewer writers means more reliance on engineers, provide their reviews quickly, and since they are, familiar with the documentation, they work in the same space, maybe they can, author some updates, smaller updates directly. But to finish, on a positive note, we have one more success story for you. And what every writer likes, not having to write more content. And this documentation task was to provide step-by-step instructions for a new configuration file that was mostly for development and testing purposes. Now, I could have approached it, in the traditional way. Okay, we are going to develop a new guide. But while I was browsing the repository, I realized we are already shipping multiple configuration files. So do I need to document all of them? And where should I even put this documentation? But, with thinking about the user and where they will expect it, I decided to do it differently. So instead of creating, potentially duplicated information and separate content, we put an overview of the configuration files and their purpose in the server README, and then provided those step-by-step instructions how to use them in those configuration files. So this way we minimize the need for content, and we provided the instructions where the user expects it. Because more docs doesn't always mean better docs. And with that,
to summarize, in this presentation, we talked about how we try to make sure that as writers, we are included in our engineering teams and that we stay in sync with them. How we try to ensure that everyone really is working together, and we share our success stories. You, whether you are a developer, a QE, team lead, writer, or anyone else, might now be asking how you could try to build docs inclusive teams of your own. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. There is no single solution that would fit us all. But we do have a few recommendations for how you could get started if you really are feeling that adventurous.
So work on user stories together. Have your developers, QEs, and writers sit down together and define those user stories.
You can try to have your quality engineers talk to your docs people more. What can they do to align tests with documentation? For example, can quality engineers use documentation as input for writing tests? And vice versa. Can writers ask your QEs to help verify the steps that they documented?
Create inclusive team culture. Well, how does this look? It starts with everyday action. So invite your writer to your existing meeting and support each other, communicate openly, and develop documentation together in a shared environment. Also, think about different working styles and perspectives and make room for those.
We hope that what we shared today will help you earn success stories of your own. And with that, we'd like to open the floor to questions if you have any.
I wanted to ask, what different skill set do technical writers need to have compared to like software engineers or quality engineers?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer it, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm curious, and maybe on the like user side, like how can you relate more to users, or like if you are like learning that in some way, or is just your natural empathy? So maybe like such soft skills, and compare maybe to also the like technical skills, like maybe how's the depth of that, and that's what I'm wondering.
Mm-hmm.
Is it clearer now?
Well, basically, we are like becoming, more and more skilled users. Like always, just not thinking so much about the implementation, but really about how the software will be used. So the impact on customers.
I think you hit the right spot with empathy, because that is really important. When we're writing documentation, it's important that we don't write it for ourselves. We just need to be inclusive and respect everybody's perspectives and try to imagine what other people might, what other obstacles might they have. And I think that that's what I would emphasize.
Thanks for the great presentation. So I'm wondering, can you share a little bit about the CI that you are using for documentation, previews? Did you build it yourself, preview of the documentation? And what tools are you using for some kind of automated testing? I don't know, that people don't make spelling errors or checking the grammar. That would be super interesting for me. So if you have some success stories there, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the Red Hat repository, we are using a linter. So there is like a set of rules that are extracted from the IBM style guide. So that's something how you can catch like spelling errors, and also some terminology that is not appropriate.
I can answer one part of that question. We didn't build that sort of integration ourselves, and that is one of the benefits that Dominika mentioned in her part of the presentation, that when writers work very closely with engineers, we can use their knowledge, their know-how, and ask them for help to build us that sort of thing.
So I'm speaking as someone who did have this DocSys One Team magic at one point, and we lost it. One of the things that I've observed with the technical writers I've worked with is that they're usually assigned to multiple teams, and so they have to context switch, and they also are working off of even like a different Jira board, and we can't even see their stack and what their priorities are. So do you have any strategies on the engineering side of how we can sort of collaborate and ensure that sort of we're on the same page with what being asked of our technical writer who might be embedded with multiple teams? Or have you encountered that situation before?
Well, I totally understand you, because I was in that situation as a writer, and I think the solution is to have those sprints together with engineers and have the same workload. When there is, some part of work coming from different teams, then it's just really hard to keep up with the development. So definitely the same tracker for issues, and preferably like working on the same features at that time, yeah.
If you're asking how to collaborate with your writers if you're not closely aligned, then I'm sorry, the answer from my side would be not exactly possible, because the point is to have that close collaboration. The point is to stay close. So that is our solution. If on teams where it is not currently possible or preferable to stay that close, that's not really what we would recommend. But that was very negative. So to stay positive, maybe just try to get closer, try to reintroduce that close collaboration again, because now that you don't have it, perhaps you see why it was good to have it. So it might be a good point to bring it back.
So when you were, you asked about the skills. So brilliant presentation, I love it. I will try to ask my team to watch it with attention. There is a famous product manager called Teresa Torres. She talks about the product trio, which is mainly compounded by a product manager, a product owner, a technical lead, and UI UX. And you were playing the role of the UI UX a lot while you were describing it, which is amazing. So it requires more their role with the customer user-centric. It's more like, okay, I put myself on the user shoes and I'm trying to use it. And I had this experience for a few months with like technical lead and etc. And we were together trying to understand, okay, how can we improve the ideas we come to the table? It was amazing, to perfect. And we were meeting close as possible on a weekly basis and etc. and trying to go through hypotheses and etc. We can think later if you want. But my question is, how did you deal with quality engineers that they stick to, we have to automate and describe every single bug, versus from a product perspective, let's test the product from a user perspective instead of, oh, Bugzilla 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tests automated.
Close collaboration. I mean, I don't think I've ever been in that situation that you're describing, but close collaboration, communication, explaining priorities, that would be my answer. I mean, if the team doesn't share the priorities, you might not get very far, I think. I'm afraid I haven't faced that exactly, but I would try to bring everyone on board and just try to talk about the priorities and try to get everyone on the same page. Might not get you there, but might be a good step, for the first step. Thank you. I think that concludes our time for today. So thank you for the question. Thank you for listening.